Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio.
Welcome to the messengers in our home. Dear Kardec Radio listeners, welcome back to the messengers in our home. Tonight we're going to talk about the experiences Belarmino, the instructor, had during his last incarnation here on Earth. Hello Mackenzie.
Hi Francisca. And hello dear friends of Kardec Radio. Welcome back to another chapter of the messengers in our home.
So before we start, we invite you all to turn inwards with your thoughts, letting go of our days, and connecting to God for our opening prayer. Dear Mother, Father God, Creator of the universe and of our yet small hearts, we thank you so much for our lives, the opportunities and challenges we face each day, because all are opportunities for us to grow, depending on our choices. And so we ask you to support us, to give us strength and courage to overcome our inner weaknesses, so that we can be as successful as possible in our daily tasks and in loving you above all else and our neighbor as ourselves. We'd like to welcome the spiritual benefactors of Kardec Radio. I'm deeply grateful for the inspiration. We ask them to continue to support us in our efforts to learn and to study about the connections between the life and the spiritual realm, and what we are going through here on Earth, giving us consolation and help whenever we need it. And with your permission, we would like to start our meeting tonight. So be it. Let us now listen to the reading of chapter 11. Enjoy.
Chapter 11. Belarmino, the Instructor. Such lessons were eminently profitable. They provided me with new knowledge, and above all, through them I acquired an increasing admiration for the goodness of God, who was granting all of us the chance to renew our learning experience for future service. Many of us had passed through purgatorial zones of darkness and inner torment, some more, others less. However, all we had to do was acknowledge our smallness and our immense debt, and there we all were, together in No Solar, restoring depleted energies and re-establishing work plans. Hope was blooming once again for all of us. No one felt left out. I noticed several mediums exchanging ideas regarding the panorama of their accomplishments, and I heard so many remarks about instructors that I asked Vicente discreetly, for my own spiritual growth, would it be possible to hear about the experiences of some knowledgeable instructor who might be staying here for a while? Gathering information from so many mediums is proving to be extremely beneficial. I don't think I should miss out on such an opportunity if there's one. Vicente thought for a minute and responded, "Let's go find Belarmino Ferreira. He and I have been friends for a few months." I followed him through various groups. We found Belarmino in a corner, talking to a friend. His serious face and slow gestures revealed great sadness in his humble gaze. Vicente introduced me and an instructive conversation ensued. After exchanging a few ideas, Belarmino spoke with feeling. "So, my friend, would you like to learn about the afflictions of a failed instructor?" "I'm sure that's not the case," I replied, smiling. "I would like to hear about your experience and also to gain something from your learned words." Ferreira tried to force a smile that expressed all the remorse still smoldering in his soul, and said, "The mission of a doctrinal instructor is extremely serious for anyone. It was not without good reason that the title Master was attributed to our Lord Jesus. Only since arriving here have I really begun to ponder this profound truth. I have meditated a great deal, reflected intensely, and concluded that for us to attain a glorious resurrection, there is no other path for the time being than the one walked by the divine instructor himself. His attitude is worthy of mention because he kept himself from becoming enslaved to earthly assets. In the gospel, we see the Lord only doing good, teaching love, enlightening people, and spreading the truth. Have you ever thought about that? After many long periods of meditation, I arrived at the realization that in human life, along with those who administer and those who obey, there are those who teach. This led me to the conclusion that in the earthly realms there are stewards, co-workers, and servants. Those who teach are primarily of the third category. Do you understand, my brother? Ah, yes. I had understood perfectly. Belarmino's appraisal was profound, irrefutable. In fact, I had never heard such beautiful ideas about the educational mission. After a short pause, he continued, serious as ever. It certainly is strange that I failed, having known so much. My unfortunate tragedy, however, is the same as for all those who know the good, but forget to practice it. He fell silent again, thinking some more, and then proceeded. I left No Solar several years ago with the task of instructing in the area of evangelical spiritism. My promises before I left here were enormous. My selfless Elisa was ready to accompany me in my toilsome service. She would be my dutiful wife, my blessed friend, just as she had always been. My job would consist of working diligently for the Lord's gospel, instructing first of all by example, and then by words. 2 important colonies in the neighborhood of No Solar had already sent many to serve as mediums, and they asked our governor to take part by sending competent missionaries to teach and lead. In spite of my guilt-ridden past, I applied for the position with an endorsement from Minister Gideon, who was most eager to help me. I would perform activities involving my own personal redemption while assisting in the honorable task of bringing light to our brothers and sisters on the visible and invisible planes. Above all, I took upon myself the duty of supporting mediumistic organizations, encouraging my companions in struggle who had been put on earth to serve the immortal ideal. However, I was unable to escape the entangling web of temptation. From childhood, my parents had helped me with the comforting and edifying ideas of Christian spiritism. Various seemingly random circumstances led me to become the president of a large spiritist center. Its services were promising, its activities worthwhile and constructive. but led by an excessive attachment to my position as captain of the doctrinal ship, I placed too many demands upon myself. 8 mediums extremely dedicated to the evangelical effort offered to help me out. However, I sought to put the scientific rule of infallible proof above everything else. I closed my eyes to the law of individual merit and forgot the imperatives of personal effort. Filled with vanity regarding my own knowledge on the matter, I began to attract individuals of an inferior mental condition to our circle, individuals who held important but ephemeral positions in philosophical culture and scientific research. Strange, self-centered intentions began to callously flourish in my personal character. My newfound friends wanted all sorts of demonstrations, and eager to attract collaborators from the area of science, I forced the poor mediums to make many long forays into the invisible realms. The results were always negative, because each person will receive, both now and in the future, according to his or her own deeds. This really aggravated me. Bit by bit, doubt began to creep into my heart. I lost the peace I used to enjoy. The mediums shrank away from my extravagances, and I began to see them as ill-willed and untrustworthy. Our meetings continued, but I progressed from doubt to deadly disbelief. Weren't we a group involved in the interactive exchange between the visible and invisible worlds? Weren't mediums merely devices to be used by deceased communicators? Why wouldn't spirits that could meet our immediate material needs communicate too? Wouldn't it be better to establish a mechanical and rapid process for spirit communications? Why were those on the invisible plane negating my aims to objectively demonstrate the worth of the new doctrine? Elisa tried in vain to call me back to the religious and spiritually edifying realms where my tormented soul could find relief. The Gospel, however, is a divine book, and as long as we remain stuck in the blindness of vanity and ignorance, it will not reveal its sacred treasures. It was for this very reason that I branded it as obsolete. I went from disaster to disaster, and before I could finally settle into my mission of teaching, my esteemed friends from the arena of Earth's inferior ways of thinking had dragged me into the depths of utter disbelief. I switched from our Christian group, where I could have built an eternal structure, to the realm of politics, not the authentic politics that spiritually edify, but to the inferior, corrupt politics that hinder general progress and create nothing but confusion in incarnate spirits. There I remained at a standstill for a long time, sidetracked from my fundamental goals because slavery to money had changed my sentiments. And I remained like that until I ended my days, financially successful, but with a body riddled with infirmities, with a comfortable palace of stone, but a desert in my heart. Since my old inferior nature had resurfaced once more, I was bound again to unworthy spirits, both in incarnate and discarnate realms. The rest, my friend, you can guess. Torment, remorse, expiation. Concluding, he affirmed, "But how could it have been otherwise? How can we learn without going to school, without returning to the good and correcting the evil?" "Yes, Belarmino," I said, embracing him, "you're right. And I can see that I have come not only to a messenger center, but to a center of great learning. So, today we're talking about chapter 11. And just like the previous chapters that we've been talking and studying, this chapter is also, and again, a story of another spirit who had the opportunity to reincarnate, just like we are having our opportunity right now. And he will tell us his story. Well, actually, we already heard or read the story and heard here right before we start our conversation. But what is different about this time, about the story this time, about this chapter? What is different about this chapter is that the story of this spirit, of this person, is not of him being a medium per se, right? Remember, when we talk and when we say, oh, this person is a medium, what we are usually saying is that the person has a mediumistic ability that you can really pinpoint. While the person can see a spirit who is already discarnated, or a person who can hear the spirits talking, or a person who has the ability of channeling the spirit through writing, for example, right? We call in English we usually refer to these abilities as channeling. We have specific names for these abilities in Spiritism: psychography, in psychophony for the ones psychographers, the ones who can are able to allow the spirits to write through them, and psychophoners, the ones who are able to allow the spirit or a spirit to talk through them. So, but in this case, in this chapter, we are talking about Belarmino, who is not a medium of this kind. He will be an instructor. And here comes an important definition, at least for us to understand a little bit more about this word instructor in this context. Naturally, we know that an instructor is a person who teaches, right? Who gives instructions to others so that they can perform better at their work. It may be a teacher, right? A master. And naturally, Belarmino talks about this during the chapter. However, it is important for us to understand the context of this word in the Spiritist doctrine, or in Spiritism. Usually this word instructor is given to a worker, to a person who works in a mediumistic session. And there are the mediums who will receive the messages, who will be able to talk or to give the messages from the spirit world to us, be it through writing, through speaking, or only listening and relaying the message. And the instructor in this specific setting is the one who has the ability to talk and to master over the whole session. So let's say if a spirit is given an instruction or is trying to tell her or his story to us in a mediumistic session, the instructor will be the one who needs and who will instruct, who will give instructions of light, of love to that spirit, so that the instructor can help the discarnate spirit to move away from the wrongdoings of the past, to understand that the spirit is now discarnated, it's not incarnated yet. And yes, there are some people who die and still think that they are alive, but meaning naturally they are alive. They died, but what died was the body, as we keep repeating here. They are still alive, but what they think is that they are still alive with their bodies, and they are so confused that they don't understand that they died yet. So the instructor is that person. It can be a woman, it can be a man, that will talk to those spirits to try to show them what their situation really is, so that they can move on and they can be helped by other spiritual benefactors from the spiritual world to let them see things in the real light, that they need to go on, that they need to detach from what they're thinking or to what they're living or clinging to, even though they are already discarnated. So this is the word instructor here, which is very important for us to understand. Not only this chapter 11, but also the next chapter that we're going to talk about next week, which is chapter 12. But so, and then we find Belarmino, right, which is the name of this character. However, Andre doesn't present Belarmino right from the beginning, and he doesn't present him, but he starts by reflecting upon the lessons that he already learned on this very brief morning, or this brief afternoon that he's been listening. He listened to Telesphoro, listened to a few other spirits, stories of a few other spirits, and how much knowledge he's been able to gather from those situations, which is very saying also, because Andre starts by showing us that he is a student, right? And he starts by saying such lessons were eminently profitable. So we are receiving lessons at all times. But are we learning, right? What are we doing with that knowledge? And that's what this chapter is about, right? And that's why Andre starts by using these words of knowledge, of lessons, instructor. So it is very important for us to pay attention and to pay attention to these words, right? To the idea of learning, of teaching, and what am I doing with the knowledge that I have. So when he goes on, they provided me with new knowledge once again, right? And with this knowledge, he increased his admiration for the goodness of God, because it is by understanding that we will not die, in Andre's case, that he is not dead, that he is still alive, that by learning with other people, with other spirits, with spirits that went through problems, went through difficulties, that he learns that God is good, because we are able to renew the learning experience, not only to increase the knowledge, but for future service. And that's a big question, right, for ourselves. Why am I learning something? Why am I getting new knowledge? And he goes on and says that many of us passed through purgatorial zones of darkness and inner torment. Some more, other less. Naturally, we are here, incarnated. So at this moment, we cannot say that we went through those purgatorial zones the way that he wants us to see it, because naturally he is discarnated. He went through the umbral to the lower zones, to those dark zones. But we have our inner torments. But why do we go through that? Right? If not for us to learn that for all actions or inactions, there are consequences, and that we are very small, but we have our responsibilities. Also, that if I am going through this period of darkness, this period of hardships, we have to understand that we have debts, that we need to pay back what we took from divinity, what we took from what God granted us, what we took from what God gave us to work with, our talents, right? Remembering here the story and the parable of the talents that Jesus recounts to us, right? That the king or the owner of the land went away and left, called 3 of his servants and left with them some talents, so that when he would come back, and he would call all of them and see what they did with their talents. And Some of them really worked hard, multiplied the talents, and one just entered and did nothing with the talent. The question is, what am I giving back, right? Shouldn't I really strive to use those talents and not just put them away and do nothing, right? This is a big question for all of us. And then he says, well, we were all there at No Solar, replenishing, right, restoring depleted energies and reestablishing work plans. We were all there, and we said that before, maybe not in No Solar specifically, but probably in another spiritual city, learning with spirits, having guidance from spirits that took care of us, and setting up plans for ourselves for once when we would be reincarnated here, and we are reincarnated now. And at the time, we can probably put ourselves there and say, okay, I understood and hope what bloomed at one point for us to say, okay, I did this in the past, and now I need to come back to do something. Andres says, no one felt left out. And we probably, if we naturally not all of us will remember, as I don't remember, for example, but we probably, just like he is describing to us here, we were there talking and exchanging ideas and saying, oh, we will be able to do this, we will have another opportunity, let's go and let's strive to do our best, and so on and so forth. Andre was so excited, right, was so interested in learning more and more, that he approached Vicente, he was together with Vicente already, but he came to Vicente and asked him to hear experiences from other people, right? And he at this time asked specifically to hear a story of a person who was a knowledgeable instructor, right? Is there anybody here that you know of? Because knowing information from so many mediums was really interesting. So I wouldn't want to waste the opportunity of learning from a spirit who had the chance to do something, not specifically on being a medium, but of being this instructor that we just mentioned. It is important for us, right, to keep our ears tuned to stories of all sorts of different people so that we can see how much they struggle, what their problems are, what their difficulties are, so that we prepare ourselves for everything or anything that can happen and that happens in our lives. Vicente thought for a minute and said, well, there's a person around here. We've been friends for a few months, and his name is Belarmino Ferreira. And here comes the interesting point about Belarmino Ferreira, at least in terms of his name, right? It is very interesting how these names are built, because at first they apparently don't mean nothing specifically, but Belarmino means, or can mean, right? It can have different meanings, but there's something that catches our eyes here, because Belarmino can mean, one of the meanings is a person who has a beautiful armor. So it is as if he is protected, right, by this armor. But what is more interesting is that when you join these two names together, right, Belarmino and Ferreira comes from Portuguese or Spanish, from the old world, the ancient world, from Europe, and Ferreira is a family name that, just like, for example, The Wheelers here in the United States, where I live, is a family that dates to the age where they usually built, or they used to build, wheels, right, for those carriages. And so Ferreira has the same vein, goes in the same vein, and is a family who used to work with iron or steel, meaning a blacksmith, for example. So it's Belarmino Ferreira comes from a family that builds, or that's a blacksmith, and Belarmino, is one with a beautiful armor, or shining armor. So it is very interesting how these names are built here. So, and we will see how this name plays out close to as we go along with the chapter. And then after Vicente says that, they stroll along, going through various groups, and they finally find Belarmino, and he is talking at this moment to a friend, and we will know next chapter that we will know that friend's story on chapter 12 of the book, and we see him with a serious face and slow gestures that Andre tells us that reveals a great sadness in his humble gaze, which is really interesting to see these slow gestures. Can you imagine a person in an armor, even if it's a beautiful armor, how probably heavy that is, right, to carry, and how slow you might probably need to move because of the weight of that armor, right, and the serious face of the armor, which when we are using a cover on our face, how do I show emotions, right? How do those emotions are seen from the exterior if I'm wearing an armor, right? But Vicente introduces them, and they start talking. They start exchanging a few ideas, and Belarmino speaks for the first time. So, my friend, would you like to learn about the afflictions of a failed instructor? He asks us. He asks Andre, and Andre replies, smiling, I'm sure it's not the case, but I would like to hear about your experience and also to gain something from your learned words. Once again, the learning process here, the process of acquiring knowledge, and that's what Belarmino was supposed to do, and he did naturally to a certain degree, but as we all heard the story, he failed in the task that he gave himself into before he reincarnated. He chose his task, and he was not able to fulfill it completely. Andre says that Ferreira, which is Belarmino, it's interesting how he interchanges these words, tried to force a smile that expressed all the remorse still smoldering in his soul, and said, smoldering here in fire, right? Which is also interesting, at least the choice of this word in English, because, a blacksmith needs to use fire, right, to bend the iron, and it is an interesting choice of words here. So Ferreira tries to force a smile, right? It is something that it's not natural for him yet. Maybe he will need to get rid of that armor at some point. But then he starts that saying that the mission of a doctrinal instructor is extremely serious for anyone. And he starts the comparison to Jesus, and the idea that Jesus was a master, that he was given the title of a master. And so we stop to think about what is this mission of a doctrinal instructor and why it is extremely serious for everyone. It is very important for us to remember in these days. I guess we are being reminded more and more often, at least that have some friends that are teachers, And we can see how important, and also by being a father, we can clearly see how important to be a teacher is, right? How important the example, the words, and everything that a teacher does, how important it is in the formation of a person, right? So imagine if you are in the mission of a doctrinal instructor, right? If it is important for us to be a good teacher, to have a good teacher for our children, imagine if we are a doctrinal instructor. And that's a weight on us too, because if I have kids, which I do, what is our responsibility? In my case, what is my responsibility in being this instructor? Because it is through our example, it is through our words that they learn. And depending on the type of the words and the actions that I'm taking during my life, I will be responsible for actions that those who are watching me, that are under my gaze, will be able to form their personalities, to see their examples, and to go through with their lives. Naturally, we are not taking out of themselves the responsibility of following or not following the examples. We are responsible for ourselves, but we as teachers also have the responsibility of forming them. And if they trust them, which usually is the case with fathers and mothers, and if we don't behave accordingly to the laws of the universe, then we are also co-creators and co-responsible in the formation of others. So in this case here of Belarmino, what he is saying is, I was supposed to be and to become a responsible, right? A person responsible for a group of people. And not only in terms of physical or material education, but more than that, responsible for spiritual education, right? That's what he is trying to convey to us here. When he says this doctrinal instructor, he's telling us of his responsibility as if we were talking about a Catholic religion, the Catholic religion, we would be a priest. If of Buddhism, would be a monk, and so on and so forth. So here, as in Spiritism, we don't have those ordinances, but we assume the responsibility once we are in a Spiritist center of learning, of passing along the teachings, and with the same responsibility, we would need to take this job, well, we don't call it a job, but this task very seriously, because we are having a deep and large impact, or we can have a deep and large impact on those who look for help in a Spiritist center. So that's why he says that the mission of a doctrinal instructor is extremely serious for everyone, for anyone, right? For the ones who have the opportunity or who have that mission or that task to do this. So can we imagine Jesus? And that's why he makes the comparison, right? Belarmino says that once he came back from earth to No Solar, he began to ponder the truth of why Jesus was a master. And he says that in the gospel, we only see Jesus doing good, teaching love, enlightening people, and spreading the truth. And this is a model for us, for all of us who are in the position of spreading the message, right? That we need to really be careful with what we are doing, with how we are saying. Because if we don't do that, it will be very hard on us. Why? Because we have the knowledge, right? And then he says, have you ever thought about that? After many long periods of meditation, he arrived at the realization that in human life, along with those who administer and those who obey, there are those who teach. So the administrators and the ones who obey. But then among these, there are those who teach. And then he tells us that he thinks that there are stewards, co-workers, and servants. And that the teachers, those who teach, are primarily of the third category, are the ones who need to be servants. And that's what Jesus did, right? At all times, he served, he served, he served. There's even that passage when he tells us that he came here not to be served, but to serve. And if we don't take that as a true meaning of what we are here to do, then we still didn't understand what is to become a true Christian. And that's why he asks at the end of this first talk by him, do you understand, my brother? So we need to look at Jesus' example from so many different perspectives. But this perspective of him being a teacher is a very important one for us at all times. Well, naturally, he's speaking very specifically here about those who have the mission to teach. But as I keep saying, aren't we all to some degree teachers, right? We are setting up examples with our lives. And if I live in a society, if I have a work, if I go to a school, if I have a family, although my father, for example, when I was young, was more of a teacher to me than I was to him, although he can disagree, and I wouldn't disagree with him disagreeing with me right now, because by being a father right now, I know how much I learned from my children. But I have the responsibility with my wife to be a good teacher to our children, right? So, but once they get older and they have younger kids together with them, they are also teachers to those that are younger than them. And sometimes even to some people who are older than them that want them to do wrong things, for example. And some of these children just say, hey, this is wrong. Why are you, for example, throwing this paper out of the car with your car in movement? Why don't you save and then put in a trash bin later on? So, although the child may be not a teacher, but at that very moment, the child can be teaching and using their power of teaching by example or by just talking and saying something to teach other people. So we are all teachers to some degree. But since he is speaking more specifically to those who are real teachers or instructors, naturally this responsibility is bigger on us who are instructors or who are teachers in this degree. And Andres says, oh yes, I understood perfectly. What Belarmino said was profound and irrefutable. In fact, he never heard anything more beautiful about the educational mission of all of us. And as we already know, Belarmino will tell his story, right? And then he starts by acknowledging that he failed, but he starts by saying that it is strange that he failed because he knows so much. And he comes with this very important teaching that to my understanding, it is the biggest of all teachings that we can take out of anything that we read that is good, and that it is for our betterment, for our spiritual improvement, which is, and I'm going to read it quoting the whole sentence, "My unfortunate tragedy, however, is the same as for all those who know the good but forget to practice it." End quote. And that's why I skipped over a small piece of his initial talk here when he says, and I'm going to quote again, when he says, quote, "I have meditated a great deal, reflected intensely, and concluded that for us to attain a glorious resurrection, there is no other path for the time being than the one walked by the divine instructor himself. His attitude is worthy of mention because he kept himself from becoming enslaved to earthly assets." End quote. He says that for us to attain a glorious resurrection, what does he want to mean by that? The word resurrection is the one that tells us the idea of reliving, right? I died and now I'm going to live again. But the word resurrection here is joined together with the idea or the adjective glorious. So one can resurrect, but then it not be a glorious resurrection. So the idea here is that once I die and I live again, which is I died from, I left my body here and I resurrected alive on the spiritual realm, I got this glorious resurrection. Meaning when I die, that I find myself alive again in the spiritual realm, I'm not going to be enslaved by darkness, by the darkness that I built within myself with my own actions. So what do we need to do for us to have this glorious resurrection? Is to walk by the divine, to walk by the message of the divine instructor. His attitude, Jesus' attitude, is worthy of mention, he says. He's not saying the words, he's not saying the teachings. He is talking about the attitude. He is talking about Jesus' actions. What did he do with the knowledge that he had? And then I come back to what he was saying, right? The tragedy of all of us, just like his tragedy, is when we know the good but forget to practice it. And that's exactly what Jesus did not do. He knew what to do, he knew the good, and he practiced the good. So this is one of the main teachings of what Spiritism wants to convey to us. It is, once you know the good, practice it. That was Belarmino's tragedy. It is almost as if I have the ability of being a blacksmith, of knowing that these instruments are better forged in iron or steel, but I use wood instruments, or instruments made out of wood, and then they break, and then I complain because they broke. Well, you knew that it may be harder to build these instruments out of steel or iron, and because you wanted them to be built quicker, you build them of weaker materials, and now you're complaining about it. Why? That's the tragedy. That's what he is talking about here. He falls silent again, thinks a little bit more, and then proceeds telling his story. So he left Nosolar to talk about with the task, right, of teaching evangelical spiritism, which is very interesting to note here, because we can talk only about science in spiritism and philosophy in spiritism, but when he mentions evangelical spiritism, he is invoking the idea of don't get stuck in the words. Don't get stuck in science. Go and do it. So he is talking here about exactly the same thing when he says, know the good, but forget to practice it. His promises were really big. He was supposed to come here with Elisa. She was ready to accompany him in their service. Would be very, very hard. She would be his dutiful wife, his blessed friend, just as she always was. So they are companions. They have been companions for life. And so that we don't sidetrack, forgetting about what names mean in these stories. Elisa is a abbreviated form of Elizabeth, which means God. My God is abundance. My God is an oath, but it can also mean happy. So Elisa is apparently here to remind Belarmino that God is an oath, that God is abundance, that God is everywhere, that God made a promise and is an oath for ourselves. So we need to put God above everything else. So Elisa is there to remind him of that, and that his job would consist of working for the Lord's gospel, instructing, and here comes another piece of very important information about his task on being an instructor. Instructing first of all by example, then by words. But most of the times, we not only don't even start to instruct by example, sometimes even by words, we don't give good examples. If at least we were to use our words in ways to give good examples, to set good examples at all times, at least we would have that in our favor. But sometimes, not even by words or by speaking, we give good examples. Imagine by examples, right? By living, right? Instructing by what we live, by what and how we do. So we say beautiful things. First opportunity we have, we don't even pay attention to what we just said. And he will tell us stories about this that I'm pretty certain that a lot of us who are listening to this right now have lived through and that have seen this happening around ourselves and sometimes even within ourselves. So, he goes on. Some colonies around Nosolar sent mediums, and he would go to teach and lead those mediums there. So, he naturally, just like all of us, are guilt of some misfortunes and bad deeds that we committed in our previous lives. But even with all these things, he applied for the position, and he had an endorsement from Minister Gedeon, which in English would be could be said or could be translated to as Gideon, which is a Hebrew name also from the Old Testament, which is a feller, or a hewer, which are those people who use axes to cut trees, for example. And he was most eager to help me. Gideon usually has that meaning of a person who is very critical, who looks at all the small details and sometimes don't allow things to go through because they're so picky here in a good sense, naturally, but they look at very, very small details and say, no, this is not right, so go do it over. So if he had an endorsement from a minister who has a name like Gideon or Gedeon, right, who really wants to build something out of that tree that's been just cut, just to metaphorically speak about his name, imagine that we can all imagine that Belarmino was supposed to be really, really prepared to do what he needed to do. He said that he would be involved in his own personal redemption while assisting in the honorable task of bringing light to our brothers and sisters on the visible and invisible planes. Here we can clearly relate the instructor of the title to this side of the invisible planes, right? So he would be an instructor in a mediumistic meeting so that he could help those spirits, but also naturally those who are incarnated. And he says that he took upon himself the duty of supporting mediumistic organizations and encouraging everybody, right, to continue their work to serve the immortal ideal. However, he was unable to escape the entangling web of temptation, which is naturally one of our big problems when we are here, right? We bring with ourselves our temptations. We bring with ourselves our tendencies from the past. And it is very, very hard for us to escape from those because sometimes we don't focus it too hard. We allow them to win over our wishes and our wants. So, but life goes on, he says, right? He had the fortunate childhood of learning about Christian Spiritism. And as life goes on, he says, which I find very interesting also, various seemingly random circumstances. It is interesting how he puts that, right? As if it is random. He is naturally here being ironic because we all know that this is not random circumstances. It's seemingly random, right? A lot of things took me on this path, and now all of a sudden I'm just here. I just fell here at this place, and it's random, right? That I am right here with these people at this place right now. So no, in his case, right, it was all programmed. He took it on to really be there, and then he became the president of a large spiritist center. No, the services were promising, the activities and everything were worthwhile and constructive. However, and then he starts showing up what he was and how he was, right? He had an excessive attachment to his position as captain of the doctrinal ship, right? So he now is the leader, he's the president of that spiritist center, and then because he feels as if he is the captain of that ship, right, of the doctrinal ship, he has an excessive attachment to that position. And then he places a lot of demands, too many demands, upon himself, which is interesting. He doesn't put a lot of demands upon the others. So he is actually pushing himself forward, but then he puts too much, right, on that. Too many demands upon himself. There were 8 mediums around. They were extremely dedicated to the evangelical effort. They offered to help me out, and they were there helping. But he, instead of going through the evangelical path, he put the scientific rule of infallible proof above everything else. And he closed his eyes to the law of individual merit and forgot the imperatives of personal effort. So, what he is doing here is that, okay, science above everything. We just said that Eliza is, my God is an oath. My God is abundance, telling that God is above all things. What does he do there? Here, he says, put the scientific rule of infallible proof above everything else. And once we do that, we lose sight that we need to love God above everything else. See? So we are substituting as if science now is the new God. And then we need to go through there, and we tend to forget other things that are around there. So he forgot the law of individual merit that I deserve because I am working and I have merit to be there. That we need to have effort to get there. But he goes on, filled with vanity regarding his own knowledge on the matter, he began to attract individuals of an inferior mental condition to his circle. Individuals who held important but ephemeral positions in philosophical culture and scientific research. So, because of his fixation in this idea that science was above everything, then we will attract people who think the same, right? And I will be in the center of that, but we forget that not only those people are the best ones. Those are people just like us, just like the other workers in the Spiritist Center. And that's why he said that he forgot the law of individual merit in the imperatives of personal effort. And then when this effort that we stop making, not towards the scientific or philosophical research, but if and when we forget the effort that we need to put in terms of evangelical spiritism, and that's where he says that strange self-centered intentions begin to carelessly flourish in my personal character, right? Together with these friends that he started inviting of the scientific area, purely scientific area, and purely philosophical area. Not to say that scientists don't have spiritual backgrounds or they are not looking for that. No, but the types of scientific people and philosophical people that he was interested in or he was calling into, they didn't have that idea of spirituality. They apparently, to what we are able to read from here, they only wanted demonstrations. They only wanted the exterior, not the interior. So he was, together with those people, on the outside, on the armor, on the beautiful armor of the outside. But what is the inside? And that's when things start to be very complicated for him, because they wanted all sorts of demonstrations, eager to attract collaborators from the area of science. He, Belarmino, forced the poor mediums to make long forays into the invisible realms. And the results were always negative, because each person will receive, both now and in the future, according to his or her own deeds. So what did he want, right? And how was he behaving and conducting himself in these investigations? It was just for the exterior. And that's what he was getting. He was just getting exterior responses. And even if it's an interior response, since he is not worried about that, he will not be able to see it anyways. It's like when we buy a new car, when we buy a certain machine or a certain type and it has a brand, and we never actually pay too much attention to that brand or to that color of car. Now, all of a sudden, when we walk outside, all that I see is that brand of cars. And what we need to ask ourselves is, was it already there? Or is just because I bought one now, all of those cars are out there, right? No, naturally, they were all there at all times, but I was not ready to see. I didn't want to see. And what's happening here is this that I just described, but to the degree of the negativity, right? He wants to get something that's exterior, and that's what he is getting. He wants to go deeper and deeper, but apparently he doesn't want that. He wants only the knowledge, the superficial knowledge, but he is not able to put his heart into it, right? He's not able to really feel why and when I will use that knowledge. This really aggravated him, he says, right? He starts to doubt, and he allowed doubt to creep into his heart. And then he lost his peace. The mediums went away, and naturally, he doesn't believe the mediums anymore. The meetings continued, but from doubt, he went straight to deadly disbelief. And then he asks a lot of questions, right? And we can all see how exteriorly minded he is at this moment. Weren't we, and I'm going to quote the whole paragraph, all these questions. I'm just going to read the whole paragraph here, and you can follow. Weren't we a group involved in the interactive exchange between the visible and invisible worlds? Weren't mediums merely devices to be used by deceased communicators? Why wouldn't spirits that could meet our immediate material needs communicate too? Wouldn't it be better to establish a mechanical and rapid process for spirit communications? Why were those on the invisible plane negating my aims to objectively demonstrate the worth of the new doctrine? All questions that are interesting to pose, but once we stop to think about them, we will see that they are filled with my selfish perception of how the world should work, and now how the world works. Right? Not that we cannot strive to make it better, to understand it better, to create it better, to modify it to become better. But what am I doing to make it become better? How is my heart improving with the knowledge that I already have? Because this is one of the bigger problems that I personally see, is that once we start thinking about mediumship and start thinking about mediumistic meetings, we tend to see, or we believe that on those meetings we will get new revelations, right? That we will receive magical messages that will be able to transform my life, only because I received, or a medium there received a message from a high order spirit. And what about all the messages that we already got? What are we doing with all those messages that we already have in our hands? All the books that we already read, where are all those messages being put forward within my life, in my actions, in my words, in my behavior? And then Elisa comes up as the one to remind him and to remind ourselves that we need to edify these spiritual and religious realms within ourselves, where our tormented souls could find relief. But no, he went astray from that path, only to the exterior side. We need matter. We need our bodies. We need science. We need philosophy. We need art. But we need to have all these connected to the spiritual or religious side of all, so that we can, together with science, philosophy, and art, practice what we learn. Put into our deeds the messages that we get. But he goes on. The gospel, however, is a divine book, and as long as we remain stuck in the blindness of vanity and ignorance, it will not reveal its sacred treasures. The message of God through the gospel, through the good news that Jesus came to bring to us, is a divine book because it has light. It is life. But if we remain stuck in the blindness of vanity and ignorance, see, we are talking here about knowledge at all times, but then he comes and tells us that sometimes we are stuck in the blindness of vanity and ignorance. So, knowledge and ignorance. So we have all the knowledge in the world. We have the world in the points of our fingers, right? Oh no, search Google, search Yahoo, search Bing, and you'll find everything there. Have lots of books, a lot of knowledge, but we're still ignorant because we are vain, because we are self-centered, because we are proud, because we are selfish. And once we are not able to get out of this state, to get out of this armor that we put on the exterior of ourselves, of this beautiful armor made by this blacksmith that we think that we are the best, we will not be able to see the treasures. And that's when he says that it was for this very reason that he branded the gospel as obsolete. He was vain. He was ignorant. Are we? Hopefully not. Hopefully, if we are, and if we recognize ourselves as being, that we are working towards not being anymore, of getting out of this state, so that we don't go as he did from disaster to disaster, before he could finally settle into his mission of teaching. So before we will not be able to do what we were supposed to do here, so that we get out of this state for us to fulfill what we came here to fulfill. So once he said and he branded the gospel as obsolete, then we open up, and he opened up this his mental image, his mental life to those spirits who think like him and want to just feast with him on what he thinks is the truth. And that's what he says, that his esteemed, and here he puts into single quotes here, friends from the arena of earth's inferior ways of thinking had dragged me into the depths of utter disbelief. And he switched from his Christian group to the realm of politics. But then he put something that's very, very interesting. He switched from his Christian group, and he says that where I could have built an eternal structure to the realm of politics. So he could have built an eternal structure, but he decided not to build an eternal structure, but to build a material structure. So he came from the Christian group to the realm of politics. But he explains, not the authentic politics that spiritually edify, because there are politics that edify spiritually ourselves, right? Politics is necessary. It is needed because we all do politics. We are political beings, right? We are social beings. We interact with each other. We need to talk to each other. We need to find common ground so that we can build society. We can have a better society for all of us. But He did not go to that authentic politics that spiritually edify. He went to the inferior, corrupt politics that hinder general progress and create nothing but confusion in incarnate spirits. And then there he stood for a long time. He remained there for a long time, doing nothing spiritually edifying, sidetracked from his fundamental goals, because at that moment he got enslaved to money, and then he changed all his feelings and all his sentiments on the mission that he had to accomplish. Remember, he just said that he could have built an eternal structure, and now he recognizes that until the end of his days, he was financially successful, but he had a body riddled with infirmities, and he had a comfortable palace of stone, but a desert in his heart. So he was not able to build the eternal structure. So he built a palace of stone exteriorly, but a desert in his heart. And then he says that since his old inferior nature had resurfaced once more, he was bound again to unworthy spirits, both in the incarnate and discarnate realms. The rest, my friend, he says, you can guess and we can guess: torment, remorse, and expiation. So once again, it's our story, right? We have the chance, we have the opportunity, we have the knowledge, and now we have Spiritism. The question that we need to ask ourselves, though, is, what are we doing with what we have? Are we living in the comfortable palace of stone and also building the eternal structure within ourselves? Or are we, like Belarmino was, living in a palace of stone, or even sometimes not in a palace of stone, but in a small house or in a small apartment, but unfortunately living also and building also a desert in our hearts? What are we doing with the knowledge that we are acquiring, are having the opportunity to have it within ourselves and through the teachings of Spiritism in our specific case, but the teachings of Jesus and all other great religions and all other great philosophies of the world? What are we doing with these teachings, with this knowledge? And concluding, Belarmino affirms, but how could it have been otherwise? How can we learn without going to school, without returning to the good and correcting the evil? That's a question for ourselves, right? We all know it is hard. We've all been to schools. How can we learn without going to school? Naturally, one can say, right? A cynic can say, oh, you can learn at home. Yeah, that's true, but that's also a school. So how can we learn without going to school, without learning, without actively participating in stuff? How can we learn without returning to the good and correcting the evil? We need to return to the good to correct what we did wrong. Unfortunately, we made so many mistakes in the past, and unfortunately most of the torments, the remorses, and the expiation that we go through, it's because of what we did in the past. So why don't we just go ahead and correct the evil, since we already know what the good actively and actually is, right? Why don't we go back within ourselves, disregarding to some degree, not alienating or not removing completely the matter from our lives or the body? No, we have to have a balance between material life and spiritual life. But these days, and most of our lives, we've been paying so much attention only to the material side and leaving and disregarding the spiritual life that we need to. to live, and why don't we start to give more importance to spirituality than what we've been giving in our previous lives, so that we can balance these two things, our material life with our spiritual life. Why don't we really go back to school to learn and to practice and to put into practice what we have learned so far? Andre finalizes embracing him and saying, "Yes, Belarmino, you are right, and I can see that I have come not only to a messenger center, but to a center of great learning." Hopefully, we are all in this center of great learning right now. Kardec Radio is one of these centers for great learning. We learn about things that we forgot for so many lives, for so many centuries. We are here nourishing our souls, because the nourishment of our bodies we are already trained and formed to receive. Let's give a lot more effort then to nourish our souls. Hopefully, you are all together with us in this journey, walking in the Messenger Center to learn how to become messengers, how to become living letters of the peace and love that Jesus came here to teach to all of us. I hope you all have a great week. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to Kardec Radio, broadcasting live every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Email us and share your comments at www.kardecradio.com. Until next time, we wish you many blessings.